courtroom tragedy, and the collapse of justice in the Dae Jang-dong case from the perspective of ESQ Andre. The story begins with shocking news from the trial of the Dae Jang-dong case on January 23, 2026, when the prosecution decided to abandon their right to appeal. This action immediately led to an inevitable consequence. The defendants began voicing demands to lift the freeze orders on the massive assets they are holding. From the narrator's perspective, the prosecutor's decision to give up the right to appeal, even though charges of breach of trust were recognized, is akin to the government personally opening the door for the Dae Jang-dong interest group to disperse and recover the remaining funds. This is not only a step backward legally, but also a sign that concerns about the decay of the judicial system have become a reality right in the courtroom. In the trial that just took place, that fear became clearly visible when the group of defendants simultaneously requested the court to cancel the asset forfeiture orders. Their arguments were incredibly sharp, based on a legal loophole. Since the prosecution abandoned the appeal, the first instance verdict has taken effect, and in principle, the penalty cannot be heavier than that of the first instance. Notably, in the previous first instance trial, the court did not declare a specific forfeiture amount, citing the inability to determine the exact actual amount. This very detail became the perfect excuse for the defendants to argue that there is no longer any reason for them to be subject to further forfeiture. This incident reveals a deadly loophole in the litigation process, where the lack of resolve from the prosecution inadvertently handed the criminals a solid protective shield. The context of the trial became even more tragicomic when looking at the presence of the prosecution. While important trials in the past usually featured a robust team of prosecutors to argue fiercely, this time only a single person appeared. When the judge asked for an opinion regarding the defendant's request to lift the forfeiture orders, this prosecutor simply replied that there was no opinion. According to the narrator's analysis, this answer was nothing short of a tacit implication to just do whatever the defendants wanted. The feeling at that moment was that the entire trial was being spun by the criminals themselves, and an unprecedented inversion of values is taking place in South Korea. The narrator bitterly observes that when a person with a criminal record becomes president, criminals begin to speak loudly, while the protectors of the law become trembling and passive. The specific incident was the first appellate trial of the Dae Jang-dong development corruption case, where the first instance verdict was handed down at the end of October last year. Here, Nam Wook and his accomplices requested the cancellation of forfeiture orders regarding charges for which they were declared innocent. The consensual silence of the prosecutor, when asked for an opinion, makes one shudder. The fact that the prosecution abandoned the appeal last November, which was already controversial, has now become even more painful. The trial, presided over by Judge Lee Yi-sul of the Seoul High Court, saw the full attendance of the five notorious defendants: Kim Man-bai, Nam Wook, Yoo Dong-gyu, Jang Young-huk, and Jang Min-yong. All shared a common goal: to regain control of their assets. Lawyers for Kim Man-bai and Nam Wook skillfully argued that the asset preservation orders had expired and required action from the prosecution. Kim Man-bai's side argued that the order was based on a charge of violating the Conflict of Interest Prevention Act, but since the prosecution did not appeal, this charge is considered innocent, making the cancellation of the freeze order natural. Similarly, Nam Wook's side emphasized that the incriminating circumstances serving as the basis for the preservation no longer exist, so the prosecutor has an obligation to lift it. Analyzing this more deeply, this is the moment when criminals publicly demand money that should belong to the state, treating it as their own war spoils after squeezing through the narrow cracks of the law. The irony reached its peak when, during the entire 50 minutes of the trial, the sole prosecutor present, Young Chun-gu from the Seoul High Prosecutor's Office, was completely outmatched. The prosecutors from the original investigation team, who participated in the first instance trial, were all absent. When facing the judge's question about lifting the asset freeze, Young Chun-gu only repeated the refrain that he had no special opinion. This attitude infuriated the narrator, who deemed this a clumsy drama where justice is being mocked and the country has truly become a paradise for criminals. The image of Lee Jae-myung, described as having for prior convictions and being implicated in many other allegations, yet still becoming president, was mentioned as the root cause of this chaos. The narrator continues to dissect the social reality, suggesting that economic indicators like rising stock markets are merely illusions covering up the collapse of the rule of law. A country where criminals can stand in court and order judges and prosecutors to return illicit money is no longer a true rule of law state. The fact that all 5 defendants declare they do not accept a first-instance verdict shows that their ambition stops not at keeping the money, but at wiping their criminal records clean. Yu Dong-gyu's side submitted evidence in the form of recorded calls with Nam Wook and requested the interrogation of witnesses, specifically those from the Seongnam Urban Development Corporation who were not interrogated in the first instance. Meanwhile, Kim Man-bai noticed that the attitudes of Nam Wook, Jang Young-huk, and Jang Min-yong seemed to have changed, so he also wanted to call them as witnesses. Analyzing this strategy deeper, one can see the defendants are exploiting the prosecution's failure to appeal to ensure that penalties in the appellate trial cannot be higher than in the first instance. They are seeking to neutralize the initial ruling to achieve even lighter sentences by exploiting favorable testimony from one another. Looking back at the first instance sentences, Kim Man-bai received 8 years in prison and a 40.8 billion won forfeiture, Yu Dong-gyu 8 years and a fine, Nam Wook 4 years, Jang Min-yong 6 years, and Jang Young-hik 5 years. Since these sentences are now the maximum ceiling in the current context, they are going all out to pull them down. Nam Wook even boldly claimed that the first instance hearing process had many deficiencies and the verdict was unconvincing, while requesting to call 3 witnesses to deny embezzlement charges. This action shows the excessive confidence of the defendants, knowing that no one is strong enough to stop them anymore. The court concluded the preparatory procedures and set the first official trial for March 13th, but with the current situation, the result seems to have been predetermined. The narrator concludes that the goal of dismantling the power of the prosecution seems to have been famously successful under the era of Lee Jae-myung, creating maximum conditions for accomplices to profiteer. Based on the resigned attitude of prosecutor Yun Chung-gu and the absence of the core investigation team, it is highly likely that in the upcoming trial on March 13th, the court will approve most of the requests to lift the asset freezes for Kim Man-bai and Nam Wook's group. Since there is no legal opposition from the prosecution, the judge will not have sufficient grounds to maintain the freeze orders based on charges that are considered innocent due to the lack of an appeal. Furthermore, with the strategy of calling each other as witnesses and changing testimonies to favor their accomplices, it is very likely that the sentences of the defendants in the appellate trial will be significantly reduced compared to the first instance. This will set an incredibly dangerous precedent where economic criminals not only preserve their corrupt assets, but also minimize their criminal liability thanks to the paralysis of the judicial system. The story of the Dae-Jang-dong trial on January 23, 2026 is not merely a legal news report, but an alarm bell regarding the demise of justice when political power interferes crudely with the scales of the law. The image of the lone prosecutor saying he has no opinion in the face of criminals demanding their money back is the most painful symbol of a society where black and white have been inverted. Are we witnessing the formation of a new order where criminals hold the power to control the law? Please leave your thoughts on the future of this judicial system in the comments section below. And don't forget to follow the ESQ Andre channel to continue updating with the most profound and authentic analyses of the hidden corners of current events.